Well, I'm going to give you a really quick overview of the nutrient loss reduction strategy for Illinois. This was released just on July 21st. There was a public comment period. Maybe some of you sent in comments on it. I don't know. But this was developed over the last 3 years. We were unique in the states in the Mississippi River Basin in that we had input and development of the strategy with all the interested parties, essentially the ag groups, the environmental groups, and the point source groups all contributed and helped to make it, I think, a strategy that everybody can live with. I led a team at the University of Illinois that did the science assessment for it that sort of, I'll go over a little bit of that, but lays out how much of the nutrients we're losing and where they're coming from and what we can do about it. And then even more importantly, I guess, how much might this cost? And again, this is all a voluntary strategy. There's nothing required in here. So where the nutrients come from? Well, we're talking about two nutrients, nitrate and total phosphorus. And nitrate is primarily an agricultural problem. About 80% comes from agricultural fields, and about 20% comes from urban areas, most of that in point sources, which is sewage treatment plants. Phosphorus is more even. About half the phosphorus is from urban areas and half is from agriculture. So that nutrient is split evenly. And of course, most of that phosphorus is coming from the urban areas in the Chicago region. So the two nutrients are not the same in their sources, but agriculture has a big component of both of them. One of the things I can say in terms of the total nutrient load from the state, one of the questions we often get is how important are we in the whole Mississippi River Basin? If we add up, this shows where nitrate comes from. On the left are the point sources, and you can see the Chicago area. On the right are the non-point or agriculture. And you see for agriculture, it's really the upper 2/3 of Illinois where we have tile drainage. That's where we have the greater nitrate losses, not from southern Illinois. If you add all that up, we're about 20% of the nitrate that goes down the Mississippi River for the entire Mississippi River Basin. So Iowa and Illinois are numbers 1 and 2. Which one of us is number 1 depends on where it rains more in the winter and spring. But we are a major part of the nitrate loss for the Mississippi River Basin. We're only about 11% of the phosphorus, but still, that's a fairly large part as well. So the strategy lays out what can we do in agriculture. And this shouldn't be news to most of you in this room, but there's obviously a lot of conservation practices. We broke them into 3 groups, essentially. The nutrient use efficiency, which is commonly known as the 4 Rs, the right source, rate, time, and place, following soil tests, particularly for phosphorus, things like that. Other kinds of infield management, which is reduced tillage, cover crops, perennials, even land retirement in some land if it's really losing a lot of sediment. And then the edge of field practices, things like buffers, bioreactors, wetlands, drainage water management. You've mostly, I'm sure, have heard of a lot of these things. There's even newer things that are being studied right now. I wouldn't say they're implemented, saturated buffers, and even modifying the channel. So we looked at a whole range of those. I don't have time to go through everything we found, but we made tables like this where we went through every practice, figured out, well, how much could you apply it, if we were going to reduce fall N? How much of a difference would that make per acre? How many acres could we even do it on? What would the cost be per acre? And how many million pounds could we reduce? Because the number at the top there, we lose about 400 million pounds of nitrate down our rivers each year and about 36 million pounds of phosphorus. So we put together tables like this, put them together. We worked with Gary Schnittke, I think spoke this morning about, he did the cost estimates for this. And it comes out, it's pretty expensive, but there are ways to put down, to come up with practices that work. And in the end, you can see what we included. It's a wide range of practices. One of the things that this showed is that there is no one practice that just fixes everything. And it's a whole range of things that will need to be done. And there's a long list of those. Way this is being implemented, mainly through Illinois Department of Ag and Illinois EPA, is there's all kinds of work groups, forums, and councils. Some of you may be members of these. These are all these meetings are open to the public. You can see the list of them here: the Nutrient Monitoring Council, the Ag Water Quality Partnership Forum, there's an Urban Stormwater Group, a Nutrient Science Advisory Committee, and a Policy Working Group, which is the overall group. All these committees have been working since the strategy's released. They all have a planned schedule. And this is all to get this essentially implemented in the state and then also see how we're doing. The way we'll show how we're doing is two ways. One is tracking how many of these practices are being done throughout the state. And that's a hard thing to do. There is nobody has to report things they do on their farm unless it's part of an NRCS program. But we know we need to get some sense of what is being done. For the point sources, we have the NPDES permit system, and those permits will change for the point sources, and and they have to report their nutrient losses, and so we'll be able to do that very well. But there's a variety of other monitoring systems in the state where we collect agricultural data. Some new ones may have to be developed to know how we're doing. The one thing we will know, and that's the last point here, the monitoring programs in terms of local water quality and nutrient loads. The state has started a new program. It just went online. It's called the Statewide Nutrient Export Loadings Network. Essentially, the 8 largest rivers in the state have continuous nitrate and phosphorus sensors on them. They measure nitrate, I think, every half hour, and they measure phosphorus every 2 hours. We'll know very well what the nutrients are leaving the state. The question is, are we going to be able to see over the next years that they've started to go down? One of the things is that all the farm groups, and I know many of them are here, they're here. For example, this is the Illinois Farm Bureau's page. They've really embraced the strategy, and they show that this is the last line, I think, on this page says it's Illinois agriculture's chance to show that this can be done on a voluntary basis. And I think that's where we're at. And so I'll leave you with one last slide, and this is what I've been saying. One of the things, a lot of times I give talks on the East Coast or the West Coast, and everybody points out, well, it's just too much fertilizer. If all you could do is reduce fertilizer, all the problems would go away. Well, it's not that way. It's not that simple. But what I would say is no one practice works for every acre, but every acre needs at least one practice to make this happen.
You can. Okay, so what we're going to do really here is we're going to do 3 10-minute quick looks. So he took the where, the why, and now we're going to do, which is, there's nitrogen or nitrates and phosphorus that's making its way through the system. We all know that. And now we're going to do the easy buttons. What can you do? And then we're going to do the hard thing eventually. Dan Schaefer is here. He's with the Illinois Fertilizer and Chemical Association. He's their Director of Nutrient Management. So he's going to tell you just exactly some things that you can do that will help maintain the voluntary aspects that Mark was talking about. Give Dan Schaefer a nice warm welcome.
Just hit the space button. The space button, okay. Thank you. Just a little bit of background on myself. I come from the ag industry. I'm basically a reformed fertilizer dealer. I'm working in water quality. I work with Mark David and Lowell Gentry on a lot of projects. So over the last 4 years, I've grown to understand what some of the challenges are that we have in Illinois in agriculture and some of the voluntary practices that we really need to implement. One of the easiest things we can do is to make a nitrogen recommendation using the MRTN. It's in the agronomy handbook. It explains how to make a nitrogen recommendation for your farm, and that's probably the first thing, one of the first practices we should make sure we're adopting as we go forward. A use of a nitrification inhibitor, especially in the fall application of anhydrous ammonia, we need to make sure that we're doing that one. That's another one that's very easy to do. And also, maybe move that into spring, move that application of nitropyrin with anhydrous ammonia into an early spring application and delay the nitrification process out a little bit further. Fall BMPs, trying to get your fertilizer applied early in the fall of the year and get it in contact with the soil. Waiting to put anhydrous on in the fall until the soil temperatures are below 50 degrees and trending lower. This past fall, There was a few that got out a little bit early, but for the most part in the state of Illinois, people held off and followed those guidelines. And the commodity groups, Illinois Farm Bureau, all the people that helped send that message out to the growers should be congratulated for getting that message out and seeing. We saw a difference this past fall. Split applications of nitrogen. That's fairly easy to do too. If you're doing a fall application, do some spring and summer applications. Take that total rate, not increase your nitrogen rate, but take that total rate and move it into multiple applications. If you're applying early in the spring, do the same thing. The closer you get to a V8 corn size, probably less need for split applications as we get into that summertime applications. Switch to spring. Now we're starting to get into some things that are just a little bit more difficult. If we have to move all of our applications to a March and April time frame right ahead of planting, that becomes a little more difficult. Cover crops. Cover crops work. They do what we talk about them doing as far as sequestering nitrogen and holding nutrients and holding soil. The thing of it is, as we move further north, we lose some of the species that we could probably use to do some of this work. So it's not an easy one for everybody. And it also requires some management. You're going to have to manage those. So with the MRTN, there's a web version at the Iowa State website. And also we have the apps that you can download for your iPhone, your iPad, or your Droid. Just go to your app stores and you can do that. And it'll take you through a split application scenario. It also gives you what that economic nitrogen rate should be for your area of the state. Nitrogen stabilizers. We're seeing an increase in the use of nitrogen stabilizers, especially in that fall market. So this is a parameter that we're watching. We're able to track how much nitropyrin is being used throughout the state of Illinois and start charting that. You can see back to 2013, we see that increasing amount of nitropyrin being used. Talk about conversion and knowing how your nitrogen converts in the soil from ammonium to nitrate and how you can delay that. This is some spring soil testing that we did looking at spring anhydrous with no stabilizer versus with stabilizer. You can see without a stabilizer by May 25th on an April 1st application, 90% of the nitrogen was converted to nitrate versus with a stabilizer by the same time frame, we had 47% in the nitrate form. So it's very important that we maybe start looking at nitrification inhibitors in that spring time frame also. Taking a look at delaying applications in the fall. This is some work that Bob Hafe did back in 2000, 2001, 2002. And if you look at that, just take a look at Bonneville, and if you applied in November that year when we had a warm, wet winter, 39% was converted to nitrate by April 1st. But if you delayed to December 1st that year, only 20%, about a 50% reduction in the amount that was converted. So it's very important. And you can see that the numbers on the other side, we talk about nitropyrin, it kind of corresponds to that too, what I showed earlier. Fall versus spring, you can see spring nitrogen sales are moving upward. That's because we're reducing the amount of nitrogen we're putting on in the fall and probably that first application in the spring, and we're increasing the spring rates and the summer side dress. We're making those shifts. That's another easy one, that split application I talked about. Cover crops. So this second line shows a cover crop with 108 pounds of nitrogen applied, and you can see that we're less than 5 parts per million throughout that span of time when we were soil testing of nitrates showing up in that field from that 108 pounds of nitrogen application. This green line you see is without a cover crop. So as nitrification took place, that cover crop sequestered that nitrogen and held it, and that graph shows it very nicely. So the 4R code of practice, stewardship on fall applied nitrogen, 50 degrees or trending lower. It's very important. That's an easy one we can follow, and it's very easy to do, and we need to make sure that we keep following that practice. Another one that is very, very important, and we've got people watching us in these watersheds, no application of DAP or MAP or phosphorus to frozen snow-covered soil. The last 2 years we've had runoff events in February and March, and we've found phosphorus coming off the fields where we've had DAP applications. DAP is 90% water soluble. It mixes in with the water. It comes off in the waterways. We've also tested waterways. That's a very easy one that we can take care of by just putting our fertilizer on in the fall of the year. Using the MRTN calculator and nitrogen management systems, soil testing. Continue to soil test for phosphorus. Don't let your phosphorus soil test P's get higher than what the recommendation is in the agronomy handbook. We can control that through soil testing. Every 4 years, have a soil test pulled, probably a 2.5 acre grid is what is recommended. And in cases where you've got high phosphorus readings, you may want to think about variable rate application of phosphorus on those soils. And just promote overall good crop production practices. If you do everything, if you think about crop production, you think about seed to soil contact, just planting, think about fungicide uses, insecticides, and the corn you're planting and the populations, all that aids in the uptake of nutrients. If you have the right stand and all that fits together, you end up with a very good crop. And we know with the last 2 years, with the good crops, we've taken the nutrients out of the soil. Tracking soil nitrogen using N-Watch. We've got several projects like this around the state where we're actually tracking applications spring and fall within the same field, with and without a nitrification inhibitor. We're looking at the conversion and how that process works in the soil in different areas of the state. Very important NREC project. Is this a BMP? There's got to be a better time and place to apply phosphorus, nitrogen, and those products.
Okay, so now we know the why, we know the easy steps. And you want the bad news? Really, do you want the bad news? Probably not. But the bad news. The bad news we'll let the U of I deliver. Jonathan Coppess is here. He's a policy specialist. Upstairs on the 3rd floor, you probably listened to him talk to you a lot about the Farm Bill. And some of the decisions you should be making or should have made with it in the last year. Today, he's going to deliver some more really good information for you, this time on the hypoxia zone.
Thank you. Thanks, Todd, and we'll certainly hate to be introduced with bad news. We'll try to round it out, maybe look at it as a couple of issues we're watching around this topic of water quality, some canaries in the coal mine, or some policy issues or some legal issues that are showing up that we want to keep our eyes on. So we'll see if it's actually bad news or not. So farming and water quality, as we kind of heard, this is the big picture of what we're talking about here, right? The hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico, and we're going to talk about the Des Moines Water Works lawsuit a little bit that we're watching very closely because that's a very interesting development in this issue, and of course the overall theme of reducing nutrient loss. I find this picture to be absolutely amazing because we talk about the Gulf of Mexico hypoxic zone and the Mississippi River Basin, and this is just an incredible shot of what the Mississippi River Basin looks like. Everything in green is farming, right? So when we talk about how do we deal with this issue and what's leading to things like the nutrient loss reduction strategy here in the state of Illinois and in Iowa and Minnesota, it's trying to get a handle on this large-scale, massive issue where we're getting nutrients running into the Mississippi River and down to the Gulf of Mexico. The algae that grows out of that pulls oxygen out of the water and leaves this hypoxic zone where fish, shrimp, nothing can continue. And as we look at sort of some of these warning signs, if you will, we've seen a lawsuit down in Louisiana where the Gulf Restoration Network has been trying to push EPA to put in place nutrient standards for this entire Mississippi River Basin. The good news is that they have not succeeded in pushing that, and EPA has been pretty clear that this is something that should be left to the states because the states like Illinois and Iowa are moving forward trying to reduce nutrient loss. But it's important that we kind of keep this big picture in mind and a good understanding of just the immense size of this problem. And EPA has been pretty clear that there's not really a regulatory solution that is simple here. But the push to do something, the continued efforts by groups with lawsuits and otherwise will continue. So we got to keep an eye on it. The big one, the one that's been the most sort of attention grabbing, if you will, in this last year or so, has happened out in Des Moines. The Des Moines Water Works, the entity that provides drinking water to the city of Des Moines and about 500,000 residents, has sued 3 drainage districts that drain from farm fields into the drinking water sources in Des Moines. And they've opened up what I think the only nice way to call it is a rather novel legal theory. They're suing under sort of a new idea about applying the Clean Water Act to this nitrate problem. Their lawsuit stems around the fact that they're spending, as you can see here, quite a bit of money to clean nitrates out of their drinking water because they have to keep that drinking water with a low nitrate level. And of course, they go after the drainage districts and not the farmer. And this is sort of changing a different perspective, a different legal theory. Part of the reason why this one's so unique is that currently under the Clean Water Act, we regulate what we call a point source, right? Our pipes. You think of pipes, you think of confined, discrete conveyance of a pollutant. But agricultural stormwater runoff is actually exempt from that definition of pipe source, which means it is not regulated under the Clean Water Act. Well, Des Moines is now kind of questioning this and saying, yes, but when we think about field by field into a drainage tile, into a district tiles, and district tiles into the waterways, at that point it hits the river, they're arguing that might well be a point source, which would then obviously impact throughout the district. So we're watching closely how this one plays out. It is a long way from being completed. They just filed the lawsuit this year, but it does obviously ring quite a bit of warning sirens and sounds about, every drinking water system and every drainage district. What are we looking at coming down the line on this issue if we don't get a good handle on it? And then that's looking west. If we look east, we look at our good friends in the state of Ohio and the massive toxic algae problem they had up around Toledo in the western Lake Erie Basin, when the entire town, the entire city of Toledo was told not to drink or use its drinking water. A lot of that tied to phosphorus. It's also led to some pretty stiff changes in the law in the state of Ohio, including restrictions on applying fertilizer on snow-covered ground, frozen or saturated soil. And then this one that I think is interesting and I think something to watch as it plays out is whether or not you can have granular fertilizer, a form of granular fertilizer, if there's a 50% chance of an inch of rain in 12 hours. Now, we all know just how fun and easy it is to predict weather. Now we're adding that wonderful challenge into your nitrogen and fertilizer application system. So clearly we've got more than a few signs or signals here telling us that we have got to work on this and we've got to make some of the progress we're talking about in the nutrient loss reduction strategy and elsewhere. And I think this is where I say we'll shift out of the bad news into there are efforts that we're trying to help. Of course, because I live with the Farm Bill way more than a sane person should do, I can't help but not turn back to Farm Bill briefly, and we do provide quite a bit of assistance in the Farm Bill for conservation programs to help with some of the practices we talked about here already this afternoon, from cover crops to saturated buffers and all kinds of practices. And so the big ones that we want to look at or keep an eye on, this is where you talk the Natural Resource Conservation Service. By the way, this is their estimate of where they think the tile is in the state of Illinois, which I think looks and adds up quite nicely with your blue map of where we're losing nitrogen. But the two big programs we looked at are the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. Nationally, about $1.6 billion going into this program to help farmers specifically on cost share contracts to put in conservation practices to avoid or meet regulatory requirements. So EQIP is clearly a very popular program. It's also one with quite a bit of potential to help out. Now, I will note that 60% of the funding of that is generally designated for livestock operations, and so it does produce a bit of a challenge in a state like Illinois sometimes to get all the dollars where we want for something like this nutrient loss challenge, but it does a lot to help the livestock industry, which of course can help substantially with this issue too. And the other big program is the Conservation Stewardship Program, CSP. This is the 5-year contract. It looks at your entire farm, and we're looking to put practices, maintain practices, improve those practices across your farm to deal with what we call a resource of concern. So in a state like Illinois, obviously, this issue with nutrient loss being a resource of concern and water quality, and we can look at these contracts to help you cover some of the costs and lost income from the conservation practices. Each year, this program's growing. We add 10 million acres to this program each year under the Farm Bill, so this is one we're looking at very closely to help. Just kind of getting a sense of, in the state of Illinois, how these programs pay out. You do see the blue line here is CSP, and it's growing significantly in the amount of funds it's delivering to this state to help with conservation challenges, and we're going to continue working to see that it does that. Which takes me to my last programmatic discussion, and I promise not to go any further in Farm Bill program terminology, But this one, I think, is also a huge potential to help out with this nutrient loss problem in the state of Illinois, and it's called the Regional Conservation Partnership Program. It's new to this Farm Bill. It looks at bringing in private and federal dollars to help farmers address these issues, and it focuses specifically on critical conservation issues like this Mississippi River Basin nutrient loss. We've been working very closely at the university with Illinois corn growers and Illinois Farm Bureau and the Council on Best Management Practices on a proposal to get them to focus a chunk of money on Illinois, specifically on this nutrient loss issue. And specifically what we're looking at is how do we take the farm business management principles you guys know very well, combine it with the precision agricultural technology that we're seeing growing and becoming adopted more and more, combine those up to, again, help us address these conservation challenges, particularly nutrient loss. So helping with things like cover crops and other conservation design mechanisms. So we're working on that now with NRCS, hope to have the proposal approved soon and get some more funding dedicated to the state of Illinois to help address this issue. With that, hopefully the news wasn't too bad, and
Not too bad.
happy to take some questions and go from there. Thank you, Todd.
All
Thank
right.
you, everybody, for having me up.
So who's got a question for one of the three of these folks up here? Anybody? This is something that's going to be really important. I've got one for Jonathan off the top of my head. Just a moment. Jonathan, I'm a betting, actually my brothers know I'm not a betting kind of guy. What's your estimate in a percentage that a regulatory issue on this topic will be put into place within the next 5 or 10 years?
Well, even as a...
Hang on.
I don't know really how to make a bet on that. I think, I mean, just looking at that Gulf restoration case out of Louisiana has been an interesting one to read about, because you see these groups pushing EPA to do something that EPA itself is saying, we don't want to do, we shouldn't be pushed to do this, and the states are going to take care of it. I'm going to remain optimistic for the time being that between the nutrient loss reduction strategies that we have in place, the increasing awareness of this, and the ingenuity of farmers and the ability to kind of adapt and make these changes, coupled with some conservation assistance out of the Farm Bill, that we can actually move that forward and head off regulation before it comes down at us. I think the lawsuits, or particularly the Des Moines one, are actually more pressing to watch. Now, it's going to have a longer time frame to get through the courts, but it certainly has a very different angle than trying to regulate something as large as the Mississippi River.
Again, what's the timeline on the lawsuit?
It was just filed. I mean, they'll fight this out for quite a few years, but we'll keep an eye on it.
And a question over here? Yes.
Question was about in Will County applying sewage, biosolids, or sludge
There you go.
at a phosphorus, basically at a nitrogen rate when it has a lot of phosphorus in it, and so the soil is building up phosphorus. That's in the scale of Illinois. That's a relatively small issue, but it is an important one. It's the same thing for manure, where manure has been. The regulations, especially in the Chesapeake Bay, have been changed to make it based on a nitrogen amount, not on the phosphorus, when the soil has already built up phosphorus. Yeah, that's something, if you've already got a lot of phosphorus in your soil, you probably shouldn't be applying it. And maybe there aren't regulations now, but that's probably something that's one, because it's a point source, that could easily be regulated.
Other questions? Dan, what kinds of things has the Illinois Fertilizer Chemical Association put into place already at their dealers and networks that cause them to make sure that this message is getting to producers?
One of the things we've got going is the code of conduct, where a dealer can go to the website and sign on, that he will make sure that he passes the message on to the growers. He makes the recommendation to use the MRTN, to not apply to frozen snow-covered ground, and they're actually become 4R certified and are doing the outreach message to the growers and making the right recommendations.
Now, very quickly, on the MRTN, the most data in that happens to be from Illinois, from the state of Illinois. So when you get there, we kind of think that we have far more data. And I think anybody remember, I think Emerson told me it's at least 8 times as much. Don't quote me if you're from the news on that one. You'd have to check with Emerson. But the data that is able to be jumped out of that, and you have to go to either one of the apps or to Iowa State. But the back end comes from U of I's research, and there are far more years worth of research in that from Illinois as it relates to the amount of nitrogen you should apply than any place else. Where did I have a couple of? Oh, I've got all kinds of questions. Let's start here, and then we're going to start going around.
Dan, you showed a slide saying that there were shifts in 2014, trend of using less fall and more spring. Why was that?
So Dan showed a slide that showed a trend that there was less fall applied anhydrous in 2014. Why was that the case?
Over the last several years, and this actually started back in 2010, 2011, we started talking about split applications of nitrogen at that point in time with some of our growers. And we actually had guys reducing the full rates of nitrogen from that 180 to 200 pounds of N rate back to 120 to maybe even 100 pounds of N. And we think that trend has really started catching on and moving forward with the split applications, where less goes on in the fall. We put some in on the spring with planter time applications, and then also do some side dress applications of nitrogen. So we also are seeing a switch and Gene hasn't put that slide together yet, but we're also seeing a switch in product. So you're seeing less anhydrous ammonia and a little bit more of the liquid solutions going out, and those are pulling into the spring.
Other questions? I had right here.
It's my understanding that the Moines Water Works removes this nitrogen and then puts it back in the river. Why isn't that considered hypocritical?
His understanding is that the Moines Water Works removes the nitrogen and then dumps it back in the river. Why does that not matter? Is that the case?
So I've heard the same thing. I don't have any.
It is the case. We do this, Danville and Decatur do the same thing.
And I think, and just from the perspective of what they've filed suit over, is it costs them money to take it out of the water. Yeah, whether putting it back in downstream, that's a whole nother issue. But what they're looking at is they've got to remove it to be able to provide drinking water, and that's the cost.
So they're actually taking it out at one place and then dumping it back so somebody else can have
Right,
it later?
they use ion exchange columns. They have to back wash them essentially, and they put, symbolically it looks bad in terms of the amount of nitrate. It's absolutely trivial. But it looks, yeah, optically it looks bad, but it really is the amount they actually remove for drinking water is very small compared to what's going down the river. But we do the same thing here in Illinois.
Yeah, I think I've got somebody else. Okay, right here.
What is the breakdown between the nitrates from surface runoff compared to coming out as field tile? Is there?
Yeah, it's much less from surface runoff. That's why Southern Illinois doesn't have nitrate concentrations, and the rivers are much, much lower. So it's really, nitrate moves into the soil very readily, and so it's a tile drain problem more. In places you don't have tile drain, it can be more of a groundwater. I mean, you can have a groundwater contamination, but in terms of the rivers, if you measure what's moving in surface runoff, it's usually a very low concentration, but what comes out of tiles is very high.
Yep.
Same question around phosphorus, and then how much phosphorus is still in our sediment of some of these streams?
Okay, so the question for both of these is what's the difference between a tile and just natural runoff, and how much comes out?
Well, we used to think many years ago that phosphorus only was in surface runoff and primarily with erosion, with sediment. We now know phosphorus does move through tiles. In Illinois, I don't think it's as big a problem. The big problem in Ohio for Lake Erie is tile phosphorus, is phosphorus moving through the soil and out the tile line. Thought to be made even worse by no-till, which actually makes water move even faster to the tile. In Illinois, I think it's split. I think there are some places that there is some phosphorus that moves through tiles, but primarily it's a surface runoff, and that's why Southern Illinois and Western Illinois have higher river phosphorus concentrations.
And you think preferential flow, or what do you think?
Yeah, oh yeah, no, it's preferential flow. You can get we see phosphorus in tiles at the highest flow rates. So when the tile is really going, the water's just moving through the soil from the surface really rapidly, that's when you see lots of phosphorus in a tile.
Wait, is that how preferential flow is defined? What does that mean?
Preferential flow means the water doesn't contact the soil very well.
Oh, so it's
in
moving
other
really
words, you
fast.
can
Okay.
get water, you get phosphorus in the surface, and that water just moves really, because if phosphorus contacts soil, it's generally held very well. So for years the thought was phosphorus doesn't move through a soil. And it doesn't if the water is moving very slowly. But if the water is moving very rapidly, it can essentially bypass the soil.
I wondered if the use of cover crops has a role to play in this.
Oh yeah, cover crops. Cover crops were one of the primary strategies it's one of the primary practices in the strategy. We know they're effective for both phosphorus and nitrate, and they help reduce erosion. So there's a lot of benefits of cover crops. It certainly makes for a more complex cropping system, and I think there's a lot of people have to really learn how to use them. And there's a lot of research still underway, but cover crops have a lot of advantages in terms of soil carbon and building up organic matter. So that's a practice that most people look at as one that does just about everything.
Any other questions? Yes.
So in 2012 drought year, obviously we had a huge load of nitrate coming into the fall because we didn't harvest much corn, right? And so the load that we put on that Des Moines River or even the Mississippi downstream was, I won't say predictable, but somewhat predictable through the winter. I'd like to understand how do we get around that, even if we did everything right in 2012, we would still have that load. And a follow-up question, I guess, not to overload, but how does that load from fall of 2012 to spring, let's say June of 2013, compared to a record crop in 2014 from harvest of 14 to spring of 15? I mean, we do that much better by raising.
We're going to sign him up for something. You're right on these questions. 12 to 13. It wasn't the fall of. You're exactly right. Most rivers, we monitor a variety of rivers. We saw the highest concentrations we'd ever seen in June of 13. Now, the amount of nitrate wasn't as high as we might have thought it would be because it didn't rain. It rained some, and especially in April, but the actual pounds lost for the year was actually kind of average, though the concentration was high. One of the things we've seen is then in 14 and into 15, the concentrations came right back down very rapidly, I think because of what you said, because of the good corn yields and soybean yields as well. So I think if we're doing, there are going to be years like 2012 in the 13 where there's nothing we can do. And that's why nobody's saying that to be the strategy to be successful, it's a 5-year average of the loads, not a 1 year. And so there are going to be years where, there's nothing, if you didn't harvest a crop, and there's nothing we can do about that. But on the average, we would hope that with better yields, and that's one thing we've seen, that things have maybe gotten better because we're still applying the same amount of fertilizer, nitrogen fertilizer, that we were 30 years ago, and the yields are much better. And so that has led, we think, to better, lower nitrate losses.
Other questions? All right, give them a nice round of applause. Thank you so much.